Imagine waking up in complete darkness, your lungs burning with every breath, surrounded by the stench of 30 unwashed bodies and livestock defecating where you sleep. The temperature inside is barely above freezing, and outside it's negative 40 degrees. You haven't seen the sun in 2 months. Half the children in your village are already dead, and you can feel something wet and warm crawling through your hair lice, carrying diseases that will kill you slowly from the inside. This isn't a horror movie. This was a typical January morning in a Viking village. You've probably seen Vikings portrayed as these mighty warriors, striding through snowstorms in leather armor, conquering the frozen north with their bare hands. Hollywood sells you this romantic image of horn-helmeted heroes, feasting in great halls, living their best lives in a winter wonderland. But here's what they don't tell you. The average Viking had a 50% chance of dying before age 30. In winter, those odds got much worse. Think you're tough? Think you could handle a little cold and some rough living? By the end of this story, you'll understand why modern humans, yes, even you scrolling through your phone right now, in your heated room, wouldn't last a week in a real Viking winter. And I'm not talking about dying gloriously in battle. I'm talking about suffocating in your sleep, watching your fingers turn black and fall off, or eating things so desperate that historians won't even write about them. Before we descend into this frozen nightmare, tell me, where are you listening to this from? Your warm bed? Your car with heated seats? Good. Hold on to that comfort. You're going to need it. And if you want more stories that reveal the brutal truths of history, hit that subscribe button now, because what you're about to hear will change how you see those mighty Vikings forever. Let's start with where you'd spend 90% of your winter inside a Viking longhouse. Picture a rectangular wooden structure anywhere from 50 to 250 feet long, with walls made of timber and wattle and daub, no windows, one door, and in the center, a fire pit that never goes out. Sounds cozy, right? Wrong, dead wrong. Modern scientists recently tested reconstructed Viking houses and discovered something horrifying. The carbon monoxide levels inside reached 22 parts per million near the fire. The World Health Organization's safe limit? 6 parts per million for 24 hours. You'd be breathing nearly 4 times the toxic limit every single day for 5 months straight. But here's where it gets worse. That fire pit had no chimney, just a hole in the roof that barely worked. When Danish researchers had volunteers live in these reconstructed houses for just 1 week, their lung function declined measurably. After 7 days, imagine 5 months. The smoke would fill your lungs like liquid tar, coating everything black. Your eyes would stream constantly. Your throat would feel like you're swallowing broken glass with every breath. The volunteers in the modern experiment were healthy adults who could step outside for fresh air whenever they wanted. But in a real Viking winter, step outside and you'd freeze to death in minutes. So you stayed inside, breathing poison while your brain slowly starved of oxygen. Chronic headaches, memory loss, confusion, these weren't occasional problems. They were daily life, and you weren't alone in this toxic chamber. A typical longhouse held between 20 and 50 people, all breathing the same poisoned air, all adding their own special contributions to the atmosphere. The animals, cattle, goats, sheep, pigs lived in the same space. Yes, you heard that right. When the temperature outside dropped below -20, you brought the livestock inside, not in a separate barn, in your living space. These animals didn't politely hold their bowels. They defecated and urinated where they stood, which was often just feet from where you slept. The ammonia from their waste mixed with the smoke, creating a cocktail of toxic fumes that would make your eyes bleed. The smell alone could knock you unconscious visitors to modern Viking reenactment. Villages often can't stay inside the longhouses for more than a few minutes. The women and children, who spent the most time near the fire cooking and maintaining the hearth, suffered the worst. Their bones show evidence of severe respiratory diseases. Many developed what we now call hut lung, a condition where constant smoke exposure causes permanent scarring of the lung tissue. Every breath became agony. Every cough brought up black phlegm mixed with blood. But the carbon monoxide did more than just make you sick. It made you stupid, literally. Long-term exposure causes permanent brain damage. Vikings living through winter after winter of this poisoning showed signs of severe cognitive decline by their 30s if they lived that long. They couldn't think clearly, couldn't make good decisions, couldn't remember things. And here's a detail that will haunt you. They thought this was normal. They had no idea they were being poisoned. When people collapsed near the fire, they thought it was the work of evil spirits. When children died in their sleep, which happened constantly, they blamed the cold or disease. They never knew it was the very fire keeping them alive that was also killing them slowly. But breathing toxic air was actually a luxury problem, because at least it meant you had fuel to burn. Fire required wood, lots of wood. A single longhouse burned through several tons during one winter. But here's the terrifying math. If you didn't gather enough during summer, you had two choices: freeze to death or venture out into the killing cold to find more. Most who went out never came back. But let's say you had enough wood. Your next problem was food. And I'm not talking about having boring meals. I'm talking about the kind of hunger that drives people to madness. Vikings had no refrigeration, no canning, no modern preservation. Everything they ate during winter had to be prepared months in advance. Miss one step, have one bad harvest, one sick cow, and your family starved. The archaeological evidence is disturbing. Skeletons from Viking Age settlements show clear signs of periodic starvation, growth interruption lines on bones, like tree rings marking years of famine. Children's skeletons show these lines most frequently. When food ran low, children ate last. A typical Viking family needed to preserve enough food in summer and fall to last 5 to 6 months. They dried fish until it was hard as wood. They buried butter in bogs where it turned rancid but stayed edible barely. They fermented everything they could in sour whey until it reeked like death but wouldn't kill you. They made blood sausages, stuffed intestines with whatever organs they could spare, and hung them from the rafters where they turned black with smoke. But here's what Hollywood won't show you. When the food ran out, and it often did, Vikings faced impossible choices. The sagas mention it only in passing, but the archaeology tells the truth. Cut marks on human bones, not from battle, from butchering. In the worst winters, when the last grain was gone, when the final dried fish had been eaten, when the leather shoes had been boiled for the last drops of nutrition they contained, people did what they had to do to survive. The animals you kept for milk and wool became your last resort. But eating them meant no milk come spring, no new lambs, no wool for clothes. It was slow suicide. Families had to calculate. Would eating this cow now mean we all die in March? These weren't abstract math problems. These were real decisions that meant life or death for your children. The children suffered most. Bioarchaeologists studying Viking settlements found that up to 30% of children died before age 5, with winter being the deadliest season. Their small bodies couldn't store enough fat to survive when food became scarce. Parents would watch their children waste away, knowing that giving them extra food meant everyone might starve before spring. And the food you did have, it was crawling with problems of its own. Stored grain developed toxic molds that caused hallucinations and gangrene, what we now know as ergot poisoning. The dried fish became infested with maggots that had to be eaten along with the meat because you couldn't afford to waste the protein. The fermented dairy products grew bacteria that caused violent dysentery, leaving you dehydrated and weak in conditions where weakness meant death. Water itself became a problem. Everything froze solid. To drink, you had to melt snow or hack through ice, burning precious fuel. Many Vikings simply didn't drink enough water during winter, living in a constant state of dehydration that made them susceptible to kidney stones and urinary infections, conditions that were death sentences without antibiotics. The successful Vikings, the ones whose descendants survived to tell the tales, were the ones who planned obsessively. They knew exactly how many pounds of dried fish, how many barrels of fermented whey, how many sacks of grain they needed per person. One miscalculation, one raid that destroyed your stores, one sick family member who couldn't contribute to the harvest, and winter became a death countdown. But even if you had food, even if you could breathe, your body was fighting a war on another front entirely. Every Viking was a walking petri dish of diseases that would terrify a modern doctor. Recent DNA analysis of Viking skeletons revealed something shocking. 13% of them carried smallpox. Not had survived smallpox were actively infected when they died. This wasn't the weakened smallpox of later centuries. This was the original strain, with a mortality rate approaching 60%. Imagine it. You're already weakened from malnutrition and carbon monoxide poisoning. Then the spots appear. First a few, then hundreds, covering your entire body inside and out in your throat, your eyes, inside your lungs. The pain is unbearable. Your skin feels like it's being burned off. In a modern hospital, with IVs and painkillers, smallpox was still agony. In a Viking longhouse, with no medicine except prayers and herbs, it was torture that lasted weeks before you either died or survived, permanently scarred and possibly blind. But smallpox was just the headliner in a symphony of diseases. Every Viking had intestinal worms. Not might have had. Archaeologists finding Viking latrines discovered that literally every sample contained evidence of massive parasitic infections. Whipworms, roundworms, tapeworms, some growing up to 30 feet long inside your intestines, stealing your nutrients, causing constant abdominal pain and bloody diarrhea. The lice were everywhere, not just head lice, body lice, pubic lice, all carrying their own special gifts. Typhus, relapsing fever, trench fever diseases that caused raging fevers, delirium, and death. In the close quarters of a winter longhouse, if one person had lice, everyone had lice within days. They lived in the seams of your clothes, in your bedding, in your hair. Vikings would sit by the fire running hot knives along the seams of their clothes to hear the lice pop, but they always came back. Then there were the teeth. By age 25, the average Viking had already lost several teeth. By 35, many were completely toothless. The combination of a coarse diet that wore down enamel and zero dental hygiene meant that tooth infections were constant. These weren't just cavities, these were abscesses that spread infection into the jaw, into the sinuses, into the brain. Dental infections killed more Vikings than battle axes. Arthritis struck early and hard. The constant cold and damp, combined with a lifetime of hard physical labor, meant that by 30, most Vikings could barely move without pain. Their finger joints swelled until they couldn't close their fists, their backs curved from collapsed vertebrae, their knees ground, bone on bone, with every step. In winter, when the cold made everything worse, some Vikings simply couldn't get up from their sleeping positions. But the microscopic killers were the worst. Tuberculosis spread through the longhouses like wildfire. One cough from an infected person in that enclosed space, and everyone was exposed. The disease ate away at your lungs until you drowned in your own blood. Pneumonia was a constant winter companion. Without antibiotics, a simple cold could turn into a death sentence within days. The women faced additional horrors. Childbirth in winter meant delivering a baby in a smoke-filled, freezing, filthy environment. The mortality rate for mothers was around 20%. For the babies, it was worse. Nearly half died before their first birthday. Those who survived birth often succumbed to infections from the contaminated environment or froze to death when the fire went out at night. But even if you somehow dodged all these diseases, winter itself was still trying to kill you. You think you know cold. You don't know Viking cold. We're not talking about needing an extra blanket. We're talking about cold that kills you in your sleep. Cold that turns your fingers black and makes them fall off. Cold that freezes the moisture in your eyes so you can't blink. Scandinavian winters regularly hit -40 degrees. At that temperature, exposed skin freezes in under 5 minutes. Your breath freezes in your nostrils, sealing them shut. If you breathe through your mouth, the cold air sears your lungs like inhaling fire. Vikings didn't have thermometers, but they had a saying: when your spit freezes before it hits the ground, death walks beside you. Their clothing was wool and animal skins, good for the time, pathetic by modern standards. Wool loses most of its insulation when wet, and in a longhouse filled with the breath of 50 people and livestock, everything was constantly damp. Your clothes never fully dried. You went to sleep wet and woke up with your clothes frozen to your body. Frostbite was so common that Vikings had dozens of words for different stages of flesh death. First, the tingling, then the burning pain, then blessed numbness as your nerves died. Then the tissue turned black and started to rot while still attached to your body. The smell of gangrene in the longhouse mixed with everything else, creating an atmosphere that would make you vomit if your stomach wasn't already empty from starvation. Vikings would wake up to find their children frozen to death beside them. The fire had gone out during the night, and a child's smaller body couldn't generate enough heat to survive until morning. Parents would sleep with their children between them, using their own body heat to keep them alive. But sometimes it wasn't enough. The sagas speak of mothers who went mad, finding their infants frozen solid in their arms. The old and weak were sometimes put outside to die when resources were scarce, a practice called senocide. They called it walking into the forest, but everyone knew what it meant. When grandfather could no longer contribute but still consumed precious food and warmth, he would announce he was going for a walk. He never came back. In some regions, there were special cliffs where the elderly would throw themselves off rather than burden their families through another winter. But the cold did more than kill it, drove people insane. Months without sunlight triggered what we now know as severe seasonal affective disorder. Combined with carbon monoxide poisoning and malnutrition, Vikings experienced psychotic episodes, hallucinations, and violent mood swings. The sagas are full of references to winter madness people who suddenly attacked their families, who ran naked into the snow, who sat staring at walls speaking to invisible spirits. The only escape from the cold was to huddle closer to the fire, breathing more poison, or to huddle closer to others, sharing their diseases. Every solution created new problems. Every attempt to get warm put you in danger. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a constant, crushing pressure that broke minds and bodies alike. Speaking of broken minds, now imagine being trapped in this nightmare with 30 other people for 5 straight months. No privacy, no quiet, no escape. The same faces, the same smells, the same sounds, day after day after day in perpetual darkness. This wasn't cozy family time. This was psychological torture that drove people to murder. The Viking longhouse had no private rooms. Everyone, men, women, children, slaves, lived in one open space. You slept on raised platforms along the walls, packed together like sardines. When someone had sex, everyone heard it. When someone was sick with dysentery, everyone smelled it. When the baby cried, nobody slept. For 5 months, the social hierarchy was brutal and absolute. The chieftain and his family got the spots closest to the fire, but furthest from the door. Slaves and the poor huddled near the entrance, where cold wind cut through the gaps with every opening. Moving to a better spot without permission could get you killed. Yes, killed. Over a sleeping position, violence was constant. Take dozens of people already poisoned by carbon monoxide, suffering from seasonal depression, hungry, cold, and sick, then lock them together in a small space. The sagas record countless examples of winter killings, brothers murdering brothers over insults, wives poisoning husbands, slaves being beaten to death for minor infractions. The thing is, you couldn't even run away. Step outside and you'd freeze. You were trapped with your potential murderer. Women suffered particularly. Rape was common and rarely punished if the victim was a slave or poor. In the darkness and chaos of the longhouse, women had nowhere to hide, no one to protect them if their designated male protector was the aggressor. The skeletons tell the story, female bones showing healed fractures consistent with domestic violence, occurring more frequently in winter months. Children witnessed everything: violence, sex, death, disease. Nothing was hidden from them. They grew up watching people die, watching animals be slaughtered, watching adults descend into madness. By the time they were teenagers, if they survived that long, they were already hardened to horrors that would break modern minds. The smell alone could drive you insane. 50 unwashed bodies, untreated wounds, rotting teeth, human and animal waste, spoiled food, wet wool, smoke, death, all trapped in an enclosed space. Vikings had no concept of bacteria, but they knew the smell of sickness. When someone developed gangrene or when wounds went septic, everyone knew someone was dying just from the stench. And through it all, you had to maintain social cohesion. You couldn't just ignore everyone. Viking society depended on complex social relationships, gift-giving, storytelling, and communal activities. You had to participate in the community or risk being ostracized, which in winter meant death. So you smiled through the misery, told stories through the pain, shared your meager food while starving, all while slowly going insane from the confinement. But the Vikings found ways to cope, and those ways were darker than you can imagine. When you're trapped in hell, you find hellish ways to entertain yourself. Viking winter entertainment wasn't about fun, it was about survival of sanity and it was brutal. The storytelling around the fire wasn't cozy folklore. It was graphic recounting of summer raids, complete with detailed descriptions of how enemies were killed. The best storytellers could describe the sound a skull made when split by an axe, the way intestines looked spilling from a stomach wound, how long a man could live with his lungs punctured. Children listened to these stories from infancy. This was their entertainment, their education, their bedtime stories. The sagas they recited weren't just adventures, they were instruction manuals for violence. How to perform the blood eagle execution, where you break someone's ribs from the spine and pull their lungs out like wings. How to properly strangle someone with their own intestines. How to keep someone alive while torturing them for maximum suffering. These weren't hidden from children. Children were expected to learn, to memorize, to be ready to perform these acts themselves. When weather permitted brief outside excursions, the games were training for death. Ice skating wasn't recreational, it was competitive combat training. Men would race on bone skates, trying to knock each other down, often resulting in broken bones or cracked skulls on the ice. The winner gained honor. The loser, if he survived, gained shame that followed him back into the longhouse. Children's snow games were military training disguised as play. They built snow forts and conducted siege warfare with ice balls packed around stones. Injuries were common: eyes lost, bones broken, concussions that left children brain damaged. Parents encouraged this. A child who couldn't withstand violence in play wouldn't survive violence in reality. Weakness was literally beaten out of them, or they died. Alcohol wasn't social, it was medicinal. The ale they drank constantly wasn't for pleasure. It was safer than water and numbed the constant pain everyone lived with. By age 10, children were drinking alcohol daily. The mead, when they could afford it, was strong enough to cause blackouts. Vikings would drink themselves unconscious just to escape their reality for a few hours, even though passing out drunk in those temperatures could mean never waking up. The religious rituals were bloody affairs meant to ensure spring would come. Animals were sacrificed, their blood collected and sprinkled on people for protection. In the darkest months, when desperation peaked, the sacrifices sometimes weren't animals. The archaeological record shows human remains with clear ritual killing marks, dating to winter months. When the gods demanded blood for spring's return, someone had to pay. Women had their own dark entertainments. They would conduct cider ritualistic magic involving communication with spirits, often using hallucinogenic substances made from contaminated grain or poisonous mushrooms. These sessions could result in violent seizures, permanent psychosis, or death. But it was better than sitting in the dark, slowly going insane from the monotony. Even their music was dark. The instruments were drums made from human skin, flutes carved from human bone. The songs were dirges for the dead, chants for war, or repetitive rhythms designed to induce trances where participants would self-harm or attack others in religious ecstasy. This wasn't entertainment, it was controlled madness, a way to release the pressure before everyone snapped completely. And through it all, death was watching, waiting, counting down the days until spring, if spring ever came. So let me paint you the full picture of what your Viking winter would look like. You'd wake up every morning, if you woke up at all, gasping for breath in toxic air, your lungs burning, your head pounding from carbon monoxide poisoning. Your breakfast would be rotten fish or moldy bread, if there was any food left. You'd spend your day in darkness, surrounded by dying children, diseased adults, and the constant smell of death and human waste. Your body would be riddled with parasites, eating you from the inside. Your teeth would be rotting out of your skull. Your joints would be swollen with arthritis. You'd have lice crawling through every hair on your body. Open sores that won't heal would cover your skin. You'd be slowly starving, slowly freezing, slowly suffocating, and slowly going insane. The statistics are staggering. If you were born in a Viking village, you had a 30% chance of dying before age 5. If you made it to adulthood, you had a 50% chance of dying before 30. If you somehow survived to 35, you were considered elderly. By 40, you were a medical miracle toothless, probably blind in one eye, crippled with arthritis, brain damaged from years of carbon monoxide poisoning, and traumatized from watching most of your children die. And here's the most disturbing part. The Vikings who survived this were the strong ones. These were the people who raided Europe, who sailed to America, who built kingdoms. They weren't strong despite these conditions. They were strong because only the absolutely toughest humans could survive these conditions. Everyone else died. Natural selection at its most brutal. Modern humans wouldn't last a week. Our immune systems haven't been exposed to these diseases. Our bodies haven't been hardened by constant suffering. Our minds haven't been conditioned to accept death as a daily companion. We'd succumb to disease, cold, starvation, or violence long before winter's end. The Vikings weren't superhuman. They were simply the only humans tough enough to survive their own world. So the next time you complain about your heating bill, remember the Vikings huddled around their poisonous fires. Next time you're annoyed your Wi-Fi is slow, remember 5 months in darkness with no escape from the same 30 people. Next time you think you're tough, remember that Viking children endured more suffering before age 10 than most modern humans experience in a lifetime. The Vikings conquered the world not because they were brave warriors, but because compared to their winters, war was a vacation. Battle was a mercy compared to slowly dying in a longhouse. They didn't fear death because they lived with it every single day. You wouldn't survive a Viking winter. Neither would I. Neither would anyone you know. And thank whatever gods you believe in that you'll never have to try. If this glimpse into the real Viking age shocked you, subscribe for more brutal truths from history that will make you grateful for every modern comfort you take for granted. Because trust me, history was never as glorious as the stories claim. It was always darker, always harder, and always deadlier than we dare imagine. The Vikings who survived those winters weren't heroes. They were the ones desperate enough, tough enough, and lucky enough to see another spring. And most of them didn't even manage that.